In January of 2013, 21-year-old Elisa Lam arrived in Los Angeles, her backpack slung over one shoulder, her mind racing with excitement, curiosity, and the subtle undercurrent of anxiety that she carried like a hidden companion, moving through the city streets with a mixture of wonder and nervousness, unaware that her journey would intersect with one of the most bizarre and haunting mysteries of the modern era, a convergence of human vulnerability, environmental hazard, and inexplicable circumstance that would leave the world captivated, horrified, and endlessly speculating. She checked into the Cecil Hotel, a place notorious among locals for its long history of tragedy, suicide, unexplained deaths, and criminal activity, a building with narrow hallways, elevators that groaned under weight, peeling paint that whispered stories of lives long past, and a rooftop that would ultimately become the final stage of a tragedy that no one could have anticipated, yet to a casual visitor appeared ordinary, mundane, functional, and deceptively safe, a space where the ordinary and the terrifying coexisted side by side, almost imperceptibly. At first, Elisa stayed in a shared room with other travelers, strangers whose movements brushed past hers like ghosts, leaving faint traces of unease in the air, small sounds amplified in the quiet, moments of tension that she, sensitive and perceptive, could feel without consciously understanding, the subtle creak of floorboards beneath someone else's step, the echo of voices bouncing down dim hallways, the flicker of light in corners that should have remained dark, and yet in all these ordinary elements lay the seeds of a creeping dread that would intensify over time, a forewarning of what was to come. After a few days, she moved to a private room, a small space with a single bed, a narrow window, and a faint hum of the building settling, offering quiet and solitude yet magnifying the subtle tensions that had begun to accumulate, as if the hotel itself, steeped in decades of sorrow, were breathing in sync with her own fragile heartbeat, amplifying small anxieties into sensations of paranoia and disorientation, the ordinary architecture folding around her mind like a trap, setting the stage for a series of events that would defy both reason and imagination. She maintained regular contact with her parents in Canada, sending photos, messages, and emails, describing the city, the sights she had seen, and the small joys of her solo journey, yet often leaving gaps in communication, moments of silence that stretched unnaturally long, sentences unfinished, words left hanging, as though the mind behind the messages were struggling to reconcile excitement with the weight of internal confusion, hints of tension that only later would reveal themselves as prescient signs of the mental and emotional storm that was quietly building within her. Without warning, communication ceased, messages went unanswered, calls were ignored, and texts remained unseen, prompting her family to alert authorities and begin a frantic search, a chain of events that led investigators through the hotel, floor by floor, hallway by hallway, scanning surveillance cameras, reconstructing her movements, and gradually revealing a mystery that would captivate the world, combining psychological vulnerability, environmental influence, and an element of the surreal. A tragedy that refused to be neatly explained and that continued to haunt the imagination of anyone who engaged with it. The hotel surveillance footage revealed her last known movements, capturing a few minutes inside an elevator that would become one of the most analyzed and disturbing clips in modern history, Elisa stepping in and out, pressing buttons at random, crouching, peering into corners, making gestures that seemed intended to communicate with something unseen, her expression flickering between fear, confusion, and awareness of a presence that may have existed only in her mind, yet felt tangibly to viewers around the world, a visual enigma frozen in time that combined human fragility with an environment that was itself strangely complicit in the unfolding horror. Reports from guests about water pressure issues, discoloration, and strange taste led staff to investigate the rooftop tanks, culminating in the discovery of her body floating silently in cold, Dark water, alone and inaccessible, a finding that shocked staff and law enforcement alike, a scenario that challenged understanding and prompted questions that would linger endlessly: how a young woman could have accessed the roof, maneuvered into the tank, survived long enough to be discovered, and yet left no other forensic trace, leaving the narrative suspended between reality, impossibility, and the haunting aura of a building steeped in tragedy. The autopsy confirmed drowning, yet revealed no trauma, no drugs, and no alcohol, eliminating foul play as a cause, leaving only a labyrinth of questions and an unsettling tension between plausible explanation and the surreal logistics of her death. As the world struggled to reconcile the physical evidence with the behaviors observed on video, the impossible movements she had made, and the eerie coincidences that surrounded both her final hours and the hotel's notorious history, creating a narrative that would captivate psychologists, investigators, and millions of online viewers for years to come. The elevator footage, though brief, became a cultural phenomenon, replayed, dissected, enhanced, and debated endlessly online, each gesture, pause, and expression examined frame by frame, with viewers interpreting every motion, every glance, as a clue, a signal, or an omen, the few minutes stretching into an eternity of suspense and fascination, a visual representation of fear, isolation, and the incomprehensible, a piece of reality so strange, so surreal, and yet undeniable, that it would remain imprinted on the collective consciousness of the internet, a haunting artifact that blurred the lines between reality and horror. Staff recollections added context, describing subtle behaviors such as talking to herself, stepping back cautiously, peering into empty spaces, and making gestures that seemed fleeting but significant, small movements that, while overlooked at the time, formed a pattern of escalating anxiety and confusion, illustrating how human fragility interacts with environment, how a building steeped in tragedy can amplify the mind's vulnerabilities, and how ordinary spaces, hallways, staircases, elevators, can become stages for moments of terror that appear almost scripted by circumstance itself. Psychologists and criminologists debated endlessly: was it a manic episode, paranoia, isolation-induced disorientation, or an inexplicable, almost supernatural influence, a presence perceived only by her, yet real in its consequences? Every explanation seemed incomplete, insufficient to account for both the behaviors on camera and the logistical improbabilities of her final location, leaving a persistent tension between reason and horror, fact and perception, and a story that refused to settle neatly into a category, instead lingering in that unsettling space where reality feels more terrifying than fiction. The Cecil Hotel itself became a character in the narrative, its architecture, history, and atmosphere interacting with the events as if complicit, a building whose walls absorbed and reflected the tragedies that unfolded within them, a structure that seemed almost alive in its ability to host, conceal, and amplify human fragility, narrow hallways echoing with footsteps, elevators groaning under weight both physical and metaphorical, rooftop tanks waiting silently above for a convergence of circumstance that would transform ordinary infrastructure into a stage for tragedy, a dark character in its own right, looming over the story like a silent, watchful observer. Online, theories multiplied like wildfire, ranging from the plausible to the fantastical, from psychological explanations to supernatural conjecture, all focused on dissecting her last known movements, the architectural challenges of the roof and tanks, and the strange, almost ritualistic gestures captured on video, a global fascination that blurred the lines between tragedy, true crime, and horror storytelling, a phenomenon that transformed Elisa Lam from a person into a symbol, a narrative figure whose story bridged the gap between human vulnerability and cinematic suspense, a case that demanded attention and speculation. Media coverage amplified the eerie details, highlighting the building's notorious history, the impossibility of her final movements, the chilling elevator footage, and the inconceivable logistics of the rooftop and water tanks, framing the story in ways that merged reality with the surreal, creating a narrative that transcended the individual tragedy to become a cultural touchstone, a real-life horror story that felt scripted yet was undeniable in its authenticity, a story that captivated audiences worldwide, provoking fear, fascination, and endless discussion, while remaining firmly grounded in the events of her life and death. For her family, public fascination was both a source of validation and anguish, a reminder that their daughter's story mattered, yet also a relentless replay of grief, speculation, and interpretation, an exposure to the world's curiosity that amplified their suffering, a constant confrontation with the incomprehensible circumstances of her death, and a reminder that personal tragedy, once shared globally, becomes something larger than the individual, a narrative shaped by others, haunted by speculation, and impossible to control, leaving grief entwined with the unending scrutiny of the public eye. The elevator footage, though brief, remained a lasting artifact of the surreal nature of her final moments, each pause, glance, gesture, and motion frozen in time, a visual representation of a mind in crisis interacting with a world that was at once ordinary and impossibly strange, a clip that continued to captivate, disturb, and mystify viewers, a short sequence that felt eternal, a moment that could not be fully understood, only felt, the tension and ambiguity lingering long after the video ended, leaving an imprint of unease that became inseparable from the story itself. The rooftop, water tanks, narrow corridors, and elevators became central symbols in the narrative, mundane structures transformed into sites of terror, ordinary architecture elevated into stages for human vulnerability, illustrating how isolation, mental fragility, and environmental influence can converge in unpredictable and deadly ways, a chilling lesson in the unexpected hazards of seemingly banal spaces, and a reminder that tragedy often emerges from the intersection of ordinary circumstance and extraordinary vulnerability, a convergence that few could anticipate, and fewer still could prevent. Scholars, enthusiasts, and true crime followers dissected every possible element, from her clothing, posture, and gestures, to the angles of surveillance cameras, the placement of water tanks, and the history of the building, each detail offering potential insight, each theory spawning new questions, the story unfolding into a layered mystery that combined the ordinary with the surreal, the factual with the eerie, human psychology with environmental influence, creating a narrative that remained unsolved yet endlessly compelling, a story that challenged perception, reason, and the limits of understanding, a tragedy whose questions outweighed its answers. Years later, her story continues to resonate, a cautionary tale of vulnerability, isolation, and the unforeseen dangers hidden in ordinary environments, a haunting reminder that human fragility can intersect with circumstance, architecture, and history in ways that defy logic, a story of tragedy transformed into legend, reality transformed into suspense, and a life abruptly ended elevated into a narrative that remains unsettling, immersive, and unforgettable, a story that the world continues to revisit, analyze, and discuss, as if attempting to reconcile the impossibility of her final hours with the undeniable reality of her existence. After the discovery of her body, the hotel became the center of worldwide attention, journalists, investigators, and social media users poring over every detail, the mundane elements of the building's stairwells, elevators, corridors, water tanks suddenly transformed into stages of terror, spaces that were ordinary yet carried the invisible weight of history, of human suffering, and of the unimaginable events that had unfolded, each visitor, each investigator, each viewer of the footage feeling a subtle, almost imperceptible chill, the sense that something unseen lingered in the corners of the building, waiting, watching, silently bearing witness. Authorities struggled to reconstruct her movements in the days leading up to her death, piecing together fragmented surveillance footage, eyewitness accounts, and guest complaints, yet the logistics remained baffling. How a young woman could have accessed a roof with locked doors, scaled ladders, or narrow spaces, lifted a hatch, and entered a water tank, actions that seemed impossible for a single person, yet undeniably real, forcing investigators, psychologists, and the public alike to grapple with the tension between human capability, environmental complexity, and the eeriness of circumstance, a situation that was as chilling as it was incomprehensible. The video footage, now embedded in the global consciousness, revealed Elisa's gestures, pauses, and expressions in such detail that millions scrutinized them, seeking meaning, context, or explanation, each frame dissected, slowed down, theorized over endlessly, the short clip stretching in perception into minutes, hours, or even eternity, a haunting visualization of human vulnerability, confusion, and the surreal ways in which mental health, isolation, and environment can converge, a sequence that defied reason yet was undeniably real, a window into the last moments of a life that had once seemed full of adventure, curiosity, and potential. Hotel staff recounted that in the days before her disappearance, she had behaved strangely, sometimes talking to herself, sometimes lingering in hallways or elevators for minutes at a time, peering into corners, moving in ways that seemed deliberate yet inscrutable, subtle behaviors that, when viewed retrospectively, formed a pattern of escalating distress, anxiety, and confusion, a delicate unfolding of human fragility that intersected with an environment steeped in historical misfortune, each element amplifying the other until tragedy became inevitable, almost as if the building itself were an actor in the unfolding horror. Mental health experts emphasized the role of her bipolar disorder, a condition that made her susceptible to mood swings, heightened anxiety, and episodes of confusion, particularly in unfamiliar environments, highlighting how isolation, stress, and disorientation could manifest in behaviors that appeared irrational to outsiders, yet were tragically understandable within the context of her mind, a convergence of psychology and circumstance that transformed ordinary moments: pressing elevator buttons, stepping in and out, crouching, peering into a visual and narrative enigma, haunting millions, and sparking endless debate. In the weeks following her death, online communities and media outlets dissected every aspect of the story, from her clothing, posture, and gestures, to the angles of surveillance cameras, the layout of the hotel, and the positioning of the water tanks, generating countless theories, some grounded in mental health explanations, others leaning toward the supernatural, conspiratorial, or symbolic, all attempting to impose order on a sequence of events that remained stubbornly mysterious, creating a cultural phenomenon that merged true crime, horror, and human fascination, leaving viewers simultaneously horrified, captivated, and unable to look away. The Cecil Hotel itself, with its narrow hallways, creaking floors, and dimly lit corridors, became almost a character in the story, a silent observer whose architecture and history shaped the events, amplifying confusion, disorientation, and terror. Every detail of the building: stairs that groaned, elevators that lingered, doors that seemed resistant, contributing to the sense that ordinary infrastructure could become both a trap and a stage for tragedy, a reminder that human vulnerability is often inseparable from the spaces we inhabit, and that environment can magnify both fear and consequence. Her family faced an unending cycle of grief, public curiosity, and global speculation, their personal tragedy broadcast and analyzed in detail by millions, each replay of the elevator footage, each article, each theory online a reminder of loss, a confrontation with incomprehensible circumstance, and an exposure to relentless scrutiny, leaving them to reconcile private grief with the worldwide attention that had turned their daughter's final hours into a shared obsession, a haunting that persisted beyond closure, leaving scars invisible yet profound. The rooftop water tanks became symbolic in ways no one could have anticipated, ordinary infrastructure transformed into a site of death and mystery, a chilling reminder that mundane elements can harbor danger when combined with human vulnerability, disorientation, or mental distress. The tank itself, cold, silent, and inaccessible, a container of literal and figurative darkness, embodying the eerie convergence of circumstance, environment, and human fragility, a physical and narrative locus that would forever mark the story with surreal horror and unavoidable fascination. Surveillance footage, though brief, became an iconic representation of incomprehensible human behavior, replayed endlessly, each gesture analyzed, each pause scrutinized, every nuance dissected for potential meaning, the video serving as both evidence and artifact, a visual enigma that captured human fragility interacting with circumstance, creating a haunting tableau that seemed simultaneously real, surreal, and profoundly unsettling, a snippet of reality that resonated with millions and became a cultural touchstone for modern horror, mystery, and psychological fascination. As public attention grew, social media became a forum for discussion, debate, and speculation, forums filling with threads analyzing every detail of the hotel, the elevator footage, her behaviors, and the environmental logistics, theories ranging from plausible psychological explanations to supernatural conjecture, conspiracies, or symbolic readings, all attempting to impose order on a series of events that remain stubbornly enigmatic, a collective effort to understand what could not fully be explained, creating a global dialogue that blurred reality and horror into a shared, immersive narrative. Investigators repeatedly noted the challenge of explaining her final location, the water tank on the roof, accessed through locked doors, ladders, and confined spaces, actions that appeared nearly impossible for a single person to accomplish, yet undeniably had been, raising questions about balance, coordination, desperation, or fate, the physical logistics intertwining with psychological state to create a narrative that was both tragic and inexplicably eerie, leaving professionals and amateurs alike grappling with the limits of understanding, and a haunting realization that reality can sometimes surpass imagination in its strangeness. Psychologists emphasized that mental health conditions like bipolar disorder can make ordinary tasks difficult, amplify confusion, and distort perception, highlighting how isolation and stress in unfamiliar environments can trigger behaviors that seem irrational or inexplicable, yet are entirely understandable within the context of a struggling mind, the convergence of internal turbulence and environmental pressure transforming seemingly mundane actions into a visual and narrative enigma, a haunting sequence captured on video, replayed millions of times, endlessly dissected, endlessly speculated over, and impossible to forget. The hotel's past, steeped in decades of tragedy, violence, and unexplained deaths, added a chilling layer to the story, its walls, stairwells, and elevators carrying echoes of lives that had ended abruptly, stories that had remained largely unknown, yet contributed to an atmosphere of latent tension, subtle dread, and invisible influence, a historical weight that interacted with human vulnerability to produce moments of confusion, fear, and ultimately, the convergence of circumstances that resulted in her death, a combination of personal fragility, environmental influence, and eerie coincidence. Online discussions and forums dissected her gestures, clothing, posture, and facial expressions, the angles of surveillance cameras, the timing of elevator doors, the spatial arrangement of the water tanks, and even minute architectural details, each factor considered a potential clue, each theory a layer of explanation attempting to resolve a mystery that resisted full understanding. the case evolving into a global phenomenon that merged true crime, horror, psychological study, and cultural obsession, a story whose complexity and strangeness ensured its continued relevance and fascination, a haunting narrative that refused to fade from memory. Journalists emphasized the surreal and almost cinematic quality of the elevator footage, a brief few minutes of life, confusion, and desperation, replayed in homes and offices worldwide, the combination of ordinary hotel infrastructure with extraordinary human behavior creating a scene that was simultaneously mundane and terrifying, a narrative that could not be ignored, a visual artifact that encapsulated the intersection of mental health, environmental pressure, and incomprehensible circumstance, leaving viewers unsettled, horrified, and captivated by the impossibility of what they were witnessing. Staff recollections reinforced the narrative, subtle behaviors that had seemed insignificant at the time, talking to herself, stepping cautiously, peering into corners gained profound significance after the discovery of her death, each small movement a prelude to tragedy, each moment a glimpse into the fragile state of a mind negotiating fear, isolation, and environmental complexity, illustrating how ordinary behaviors, amplified by circumstance, can culminate in outcomes that defy logic. Leaving a chilling reminder of the unpredictability of human vulnerability. The rooftop, elevators, stairwells, and water tanks became symbolic spaces, ordinary architecture imbued with a sense of danger and foreboding, illustrating the delicate interplay between human psychology and environmental influence, how isolation, stress, and mental fragility can transform mundane structures into deadly stages, a narrative that reminded viewers and investigators alike that tragedy often emerges from unexpected intersections of circumstance, vulnerability, and chance, the ordinary becoming extraordinary, the mundane becoming horrifying, and the real surpassing imagination in its strangeness. Scholars, enthusiasts, and true crime followers continued to analyze every element of the case: angles, gestures, posture, hotel layout, tank logistics, and historical context, each detail offering potential insight, each new theory spawning additional speculation, the story unfolding into a layered mystery that combined ordinary reality with surreal possibility, psychological insight with architectural observation, leaving the narrative open-ended, haunting, and immersive, a tragedy that refused to be contained within conventional explanation, instead living on as both cautionary tale and inexplicable enigma. Even years later, the story resonates as a haunting cautionary tale, illustrating how vulnerability, isolation, and environmental influence can intersect in ways that defy comprehension, a narrative that continues to fascinate and disturb, a reminder that human fragility can be amplified by circumstance, that ordinary spaces can harbor hidden danger, and that reality itself can sometimes produce moments of horror and mystery more profound than fiction, leaving a legacy that is simultaneously tragic, surreal, and unforgettable, a story that the world continues to revisit, analyze, and reflect upon in an endless pursuit of understanding. The public fascination with Elisa's disappearance and death grew into a global phenomenon, fueled by the surreal elevator footage, the impossible logistics of the rooftop water tanks, and the eerie history of the Cecil Hotel, a fascination that combined horror, true crime, and psychological curiosity, as millions of people speculated about every detail, every gesture, and every environmental factor, constructing narratives to fill the gaps left by uncertainty, turning a tragic death into a cultural touchstone, a story that demanded attention, discussion, and reflection on the fragility of the human mind when exposed to stress, isolation, and unfamiliar environments. The architecture of the hotel, its narrow hallways, creaking floors, dimly lit corridors, and elevators that moved with a strange cadence, became central to understanding the case, each element contributing to the sense of disorientation and anxiety that Elisa may have experienced, the ordinary environment transformed by circumstance into a stage of confusion and dread, a place where mental fragility, environmental hazard, and sheer impossibility converged, amplifying the psychological tension and creating a backdrop that was as haunting as it was real, an invisible character in a narrative of tragedy and mystery. Investigators attempted to reconcile the physical aspects of her death with the psychological observations, retracing her movements, analyzing video footage, studying the architecture of the roof and water tanks, yet every reconstruction emphasized the improbability of the events, raising questions that could not be fully answered, each step she had taken appearing both plausible and surreal, the ordinary environment intersecting with her fragile mental state in a manner that produced consequences as tragic as they were mysterious, a story where reality seemed almost stranger than fiction, leaving a chilling impression on all who studied it. Mental health professionals highlighted the influence of her bipolar disorder and potential medication lapses, factors that could explain episodes of confusion, paranoia, or erratic behavior, yet these explanations could not fully account for the logistics of accessing the rooftop tanks, a paradox that blurred the lines between reason and impossibility, leaving both professionals and the public grappling with a reality that was inexplicably eerie, a convergence of human fragility, environmental influence, and circumstance that created a narrative simultaneously tragic, compelling, and profoundly unsettling, a story that refused to yield a simple explanation. Media outlets emphasized the uncanny nature of the elevator footage, the brief yet mesmerizing clip capturing her gestures, pauses, and expressions in a manner that seemed almost choreographed by unseen forces, the ordinary hotel infrastructure magnifying her anxiety and disorientation, the mundane transformed into a stage of suspense and terror, a narrative that, though grounded in reality, evoked the same fear and fascination typically reserved for fictional horror, an image frozen in time that would continue to captivate, disturb, and haunt audiences for years to come. Online forums dissected the footage with obsessive precision, analyzing every movement, facial expression, and button press, debating whether she was aware of her surroundings or communicating with something unseen, constructing theories ranging from the psychological to the supernatural, each idea reflecting humanity's need to make sense of incomprehensible tragedy, each post a testament to the enduring power of mystery, a reminder that when faced with death that defies explanation, the imagination becomes both a tool for understanding and a source of eerie fascination, expanding the story beyond the boundaries of the hotel itself. Hotel employees recounted subtle but meaningful behaviors, small moments of hesitation, glances into empty spaces, and conversations with herself, details that had seemed inconsequential at the time, yet in retrospect formed a pattern of escalating anxiety and disorientation, illustrating how mental fragility, environmental complexity, and historical context can combine to produce actions that are at once tragic and incomprehensible, a chilling reminder that ordinary spaces can amplify human vulnerability, and that a mind under stress can interact with its surroundings in ways that lead to unforeseen and fatal consequences. The rooftop, water tanks, and stairwells became almost mythic within the narrative, their ordinary structures transformed by circumstance into sites of tension, mystery, and terror, the physical barriers juxtaposed with the fragility of a young mind, the combination producing an environment that was simultaneously real, ordinary, and horrifying, a testament to the unpredictable convergence of human vulnerability and environmental influence, a stark reminder that tragedy often emerges from ordinary places, and that architecture and circumstance can amplify the most subtle vulnerabilities into consequences both shocking and inevitable. Scholars, journalists, and enthusiasts debated endlessly over the implications of the case, discussing the logistics, the mental health factors, the environmental elements, and the social dynamics of travel and isolation, each argument layering onto the narrative, each theory offering potential insight or adding to the mystique, the story unfolding into a multidimensional phenomenon, blending reality with speculation, psychology with environmental observation, creating a haunting, complex narrative that fascinated, unsettled, and captivated people around the globe, transforming the tragedy into a cultural touchstone of modern horror and human fragility. For her family, the global fascination was both validating and excruciating, a reminder that their daughter's story mattered, yet also a relentless replay of grief, speculation, and public scrutiny, each media coverage, forum discussion, and video replay a fresh confrontation with incomprehensible circumstances, a constant exposure to the world's obsession with a life ended prematurely, a haunting reflection of how private tragedy becomes public narrative, and how personal grief can be transformed into global fascination, leaving scars that are invisible yet deeply profound, intertwined with the endless replay of a final, fatal enigma. Investigators noted that the timeline of her movements was difficult to reconcile with any conventional understanding, moments captured on camera, stairwells traversed, elevator buttons pressed, all occurring within a brief period yet producing an outcome that seemed impossible to achieve alone, a convergence of logistics, circumstance, and human vulnerability that created a chilling paradox, an event that was undeniably real yet seemed impossible, and which would forever haunt the minds of those who attempted to understand it, a stark reminder that reality can sometimes exceed imagination in its eeriness. Psychologists emphasized the subtle interplay of isolation, stress, and mental health, explaining that unfamiliar environments can exacerbate symptoms of anxiety, paranoia, or disorientation, producing behaviors that seem irrational to observers yet are internally coherent to the individual, a delicate and tragic balance that in Elisa's case intersected with the peculiarities of the hotel, its corridors, elevators, stairwells, and rooftop tanks, creating a fatal convergence, a narrative in which human fragility and environmental influence collided in a manner that was as fascinating as it was horrifying. Media narratives framed the story with an almost cinematic quality, highlighting the surreal aspects of the elevator footage, the improbable logistics of the rooftop tanks, and the eerie history of the Cecil Hotel, blending fact with perception, reality with suggestion, creating a story that felt both grounded in truth and steeped in suspense, a narrative that captivated millions while remaining unexplainable, a chilling demonstration of how ordinary places and ordinary actions, when intersecting with vulnerability and circumstance, can produce consequences that are simultaneously tragic, mystifying, and unforgettable. Online discourse delved into every detail, from the angles of surveillance cameras to the placement of water tanks, from her gestures and facial expressions to minor architectural elements, each contributing to a layered understanding of an event that resisted simple explanation, generating a collective fascination that was both global and obsessive, a modern folklore born from tragedy, a story whose complexity, eeriness, and real-life horror ensured it would remain a topic of discussion, reflection, and speculation long after the events themselves had concluded, a haunting reminder of the fragility of life and the unpredictability of circumstance. The hotel, its corridors, elevators, stairwells, and rooftop tanks, became more than background, they became active elements in the narrative, interacting with human psychology to create tension, disorientation, and eventual tragedy, a vivid illustration of how the environment can amplify vulnerability, how ordinary architecture can take on an almost sinister quality when combined with stress, anxiety, and mental health challenges, and how spaces can shape behavior in ways that are invisible until they result in catastrophe, a lesson as eerie as it is real, captured in the most mundane yet horrifying of ways. Staff recollections of her behavior gained significance after her death, moments that had seemed trivial or quirky suddenly forming a coherent pattern of escalating disorientation, hesitation, and fear, a subtle progression that had been invisible to casual observation yet tragically consequential in the end, a reminder that human vulnerability can manifest in small, seemingly innocuous behaviors that, when combined with environmental pressures and structural obstacles, lead to outcomes that are impossible to fully predict, a chilling convergence of fragility, circumstance, and the unseen forces that govern reality. Scholars and journalists emphasized the paradox of the rooftop water tank, a simple yet inaccessible container, the focal point of a tragedy that was impossible to reconstruct fully, a physical space transformed into a site of mystery and horror, illustrating how ordinary infrastructure can intersect with mental fragility to produce events that seem to defy logic, a story that, while grounded in reality, evokes the same unease and fascination typically reserved for fictional horror, and a reminder that the world can sometimes present enigmas that are both real and profoundly unsettling. The elevator footage, though brief, remained one of the most analyzed and haunting visual artifacts in modern history, capturing the intersection of human fragility, mental confusion, and environmental pressure in a few, fleeting minutes, each gesture scrutinized, each pause examined, every glance interpreted, the video serving as both evidence and enigma, a chilling representation of how reality can produce moments of inexplicable terror, a window into the final movements of a life ended tragically, yet immortalized through the lens of technology, forever frozen in time. Families, psychologists, and true crime enthusiasts debated endlessly over potential explanations, ranging from manic episodes to disorientation, environmental influence to paranormal conjecture, each theory reflecting humanity's desperate need to impose understanding on incomprehensible events, a reflection of our desire to control narrative in the face of chaos, a story whose complexity, subtlety, and eeriness ensure that it remains endlessly fascinating, a tale that challenges perception, tests empathy, and provokes reflection on the fragility of life, the unpredictability of circumstance, and the haunting power of mystery. For her family, each retelling of the story was both painful and unavoidable, the global fascination a constant reminder of the impossibility of the events, a reminder that private grief had been transformed into a public narrative, that the final hours of their daughter's life had become a subject of global obsession, a haunting reminder of how tragedy, once shared with the world, can take on a life of its own, shaping perceptions, influencing discussions, and embedding itself into the cultural consciousness, leaving personal pain inseparably intertwined with global curiosity. The surreal nature of her final moments, captured in those few minutes of elevator footage, became a focus of endless analysis, debate, and speculation, every hand gesture, every glance, every pause treated as a potential clue, a puzzle piece in a narrative that refused to be fully reconstructed, a haunting representation of how human fragility can interact with environmental pressures in ways that are almost impossible to anticipate, a chilling reminder that ordinary spaces, hallways, elevators, rooftops can conceal extraordinary danger when circumstances, psychology, and chance converge in unforeseen ways. Hotel employees, when interviewed, described her behavior as erratic, sometimes isolated, sometimes communicative with herself, a mixture of gestures that were subtle yet significant, moments that, when retrospectively interpreted, suggested an escalating pattern of confusion, anxiety, and disorientation, illustrating how small human behaviors, unnoticed by the casual observer, can foreshadow outcomes of unimaginable consequence, a stark demonstration of how fragility interacts with environment. To create a narrative that is both horrifying and real, a story in which every detail matters, and every subtle action contributes to the inevitable tragic outcome, investigators emphasized the logistical improbabilities, retracing every possible path to the rooftop water tanks, reconstructing the stairwell climbs, hatch lifts, and narrow maneuvering required, yet no definitive explanation satisfied every question, each theory highlighting both human capability and the surreal nature of the event, a paradox that left the case unresolved in practical terms, while simultaneously etched into the collective imagination as an event that, though undeniably real, challenged understanding, leaving audiences with a profound sense of unease, fascination, and disbelief at the convergence of circumstances that led to her death. Psychologists noted that mental health conditions such as bipolar disorder could amplify responses to stress, disorientation, and isolation, producing behaviors that seem irrational yet internally coherent to the individual, a dynamic that in Elisa's case combined tragically with an environment capable of amplifying confusion, fear, and disorientation, transforming ordinary hotel elements, elevators, hallways, rooftops into stages for moments of terror that were both real and surreal, a chilling testament to the unpredictable ways human fragility and environmental circumstance can intersect, leaving outcomes as tragic as they are enigmatic. Media coverage highlighted the eerie and cinematic quality of the elevator footage, framing her movements as both ordinary and otherworldly, the mundane setting of a hotel transformed into a visual tableau of confusion, anxiety, and desperation, a sequence that was grounded in reality yet evoked the same unease as a suspenseful thriller, a chilling representation of how a short sequence of events can convey the depth of human vulnerability and the inexplicable nature of circumstance, leaving audiences unsettled, disturbed, and captivated, replaying those fleeting minutes over and over in an attempt to comprehend the incomprehensible. Online communities dissected every frame, theorizing about her mental state, her interactions with the environment, and potential unseen influences, blending psychological insight with architectural observation, historical context, and sometimes supernatural conjecture, each theory adding complexity to a story that resisted full comprehension, a narrative whose fascination lies not in resolution but in ambiguity, a reminder that reality itself can produce events as eerie and compelling as the most imaginative horror fiction, a cautionary tale whose resonance continues to grow with each retelling. The Cecil Hotel, its hallways, elevators, stairwells, and rooftop tanks, became almost characters themselves, silent participants in a narrative of vulnerability and fatal consequence, their ordinary physicality imbued with the weight of history, misfortune, and human fragility, a reminder that spaces are not merely passive settings, but can interact with individuals in ways that amplify risk, confusion, and isolation, creating circumstances where tragedy becomes not only possible but inevitable, a chilling intersection of architecture, circumstance, and human psychology that continues to captivate and unsettle those who study the case. Her family endured the dual torment of grief and global attention, each news story, forum post, and video replay a fresh encounter with loss and incomprehensibility, an ongoing confrontation with the world's fascination with tragedy, and a reminder that their daughter's story had transcended private mourning to become a cultural phenomenon, a haunting reflection of how personal tragedy, once shared, is transformed into collective obsession, leaving invisible yet profound scars, a persistent reminder that grief, speculation, and fascination can coexist in ways that are as exhausting as they are unrelenting. The rooftop water tanks remain symbolic in cultural discourse, ordinary infrastructure transformed by circumstance into a locus of mystery and fear, a chilling example of how the mundane can intersect with human fragility to produce events that seem impossible, yet undeniably real, the physical and narrative space frozen in time as both evidence and artifact, a haunting reminder of the intersection of vulnerability, environment, and chance, a structure whose cold, silent presence embodies the surreal yet real circumstances of a tragedy that continues to captivate imagination and provoke reflection. Scholars, psychologists, and true crime enthusiasts continued to analyze every detail, from gestures, posture, and expressions to architectural nuances, environmental logistics, and historical context, each element contributing to a multi-layered understanding of a story that resists simple explanation, the narrative expanding into a global fascination that merges real-life horror, human vulnerability, and environmental influence, a story whose complexity, eeriness, and tragic inevitability ensure that it remains deeply haunting, endlessly compelling, and impossible to forget, a testament to the enduring power of real-life mystery and suspense. The elevator footage, though fleeting, became an enduring artifact of psychological, architectural, and environmental interplay, a visual representation of confusion, anxiety, and human fragility interacting with circumstance, each frame analyzed, each gesture dissected, each pause interpreted as significant, a brief sequence capturing a lifetime of vulnerability and circumstance, frozen in time, replayed endlessly, a haunting reminder of how quickly reality can become eerie, terrifying, and unforgettable, and how ordinary moments can unexpectedly intersect with tragedy to produce a story that resonates worldwide. Hotel staff emphasized the subtlety of her actions, small hesitations, fleeting glances, and minor gestures that, while unnoticed at the time, became significant in retrospect, forming a pattern that hinted at escalating confusion and disorientation, illustrating how ordinary behaviors, environmental pressure, and personal vulnerability can converge to produce outcomes that defy conventional understanding, a chilling reminder that human fragility, when combined with circumstance, can lead to consequences that are as shocking as they are real, leaving an indelible mark on both the location and the collective imagination. Investigators grappled with the paradox of the rooftop water tank, a site that was physically difficult to access yet undeniably the location of her final moments, a chilling illustration of how circumstance, physical capability, and mental state intersected to produce a tragic outcome, a convergence of reality, logistics, and vulnerability that seemed impossible to reconstruct fully, leaving behind a story whose eerie details continue to provoke analysis, fascination, and speculation, a narrative in which ordinary structures become central to a surreal yet real tragedy that defies understanding. Online forums and social media fueled endless discussion, with participants dissecting footage, architectural layout, behavior patterns, and environmental conditions, attempting to impose order on a sequence of events that remained enigmatic, a modern digital folklore emerging from tragedy, a global fascination reflecting both human curiosity and our need to understand what seems incomprehensible. Each theory, each post, and each replay a testament to the enduring power of mystery and the haunting resonance of a story grounded in reality yet imbued with surreal and eerie qualities. Psychologists and mental health professionals reiterated the influence of isolation, stress, and mental health challenges, emphasizing how these factors can exacerbate confusion, disorientation, and anxiety, producing behaviors that seem irrational yet internally coherent, and demonstrating how environment can magnify vulnerability, with stairwells, elevators, and rooftops becoming stages for a drama whose real-life horror surpassed imagination, a chilling reminder that human fragility and circumstance often intersect in ways that are unpredictable, yet devastatingly real. Journalists and cultural commentators highlighted the cinematic, almost surreal quality of the footage, the juxtaposition of a mundane hotel setting with extraordinary human behavior producing a visual narrative that captivated audiences worldwide, a sequence that was real yet eerily reminiscent of horror fiction, a reminder that tragedy, isolation, and environmental interaction can combine to produce moments that are as unsettling as they are undeniable, a story whose resonance extends far beyond the physical location, embedding itself in the cultural consciousness and collective imagination. Hotel architecture, previously unremarkable, became central to the story, the elevators, hallways, stairwells, and rooftop tanks taking on symbolic weight as both enablers and witnesses to tragedy, illustrating how ordinary spaces can amplify human vulnerability, create confusion, and host moments of fatal consequence, a lesson in the subtle but profound ways that environment and circumstance intersect with mental state, leaving a legacy that is as educational as it is haunting, a cautionary tale frozen in the physical reality of space, movement, and consequence. The global fascination continued, fueled by the intersection of psychological, architectural, and environmental factors, the surreal yet real circumstances of her death compelling millions to revisit footage, study the hotel, and theorize endlessly, creating a narrative that extends beyond the individual tragedy into broader reflections on vulnerability, circumstance, and the human mind, a story that is simultaneously specific and universal, deeply personal yet shared, haunting, educational, and endlessly captivating. Scholars and enthusiasts noted the paradoxical nature of the event, ordinary architecture and mundane circumstances intersecting with vulnerability and disorientation to produce outcomes that defy conventional understanding, a chilling reminder that real-life tragedy often combines elements that, when considered individually, seem unremarkable, yet together create an event both surreal and inevitable, a story whose resonance lies in the collision of the familiar and the inexplicable, a narrative that is at once grounded in reality and imbued with the eerie quality of legend. For her family, the ongoing fascination was a double-edged sword, a reminder that the tragedy mattered, yet a relentless confrontation with grief, speculation, and public curiosity. Each discussion, video replay, and forum post reinforcing the inexorable visibility of their loss, a haunting reminder of how personal pain, once exposed to global attention, becomes intertwined with the curiosity and obsession of the world, leaving private grief inseparable from public narrative, and their daughter forever enshrined in a story of both mystery and sorrow. Investigators acknowledged that the convergence of mental fragility, environmental influence, and logistical improbability produced a narrative that could not be neatly explained. Each action she took, each space she traversed, a puzzle piece that resisted conventional reconstruction, a story where reality itself became eerily inscrutable, an event whose haunting qualities arise not from fiction but from the undeniable truths of circumstance, psychology, and environment colliding in ways that are both fascinating and profoundly unsettling. Mental health experts continued to analyze the case, emphasizing how stress, isolation, and bipolar disorder could amplify anxiety, confusion, and disorientation, producing behaviors that, while internally logical, were impossible to interpret from the outside, a chilling example of how vulnerability interacts with circumstance to produce outcomes that are simultaneously real, tragic, and difficult to comprehend, a narrative whose resonance lies in its unflinching depiction of human fragility. Exposed to unfamiliar and challenging environments. The Cecil Hotel's history of misfortune, violence, and death added a layer of cultural and psychological tension to the story, the building itself seemingly amplifying anxiety and disorientation, a silent witness to the convergence of events, a character in a narrative that blends architecture, human fragility, and environment, illustrating how spaces themselves can influence behavior, perception, and ultimately outcomes. A chilling reminder that tragedy often emerges from the interaction of mind, circumstance, and environment, in ways that are unpredictable yet devastatingly real. Online fascination continued to grow, discussions analyzing video, architecture, gestures, posture, and behavior merging psychological insight with speculation, cultural interpretation, and historical observation, creating a layered narrative that extends beyond individual tragedy into a global story of mystery, suspense, and human vulnerability, a tale whose power lies in its combination of reality and eeriness, its complexity, its ambiguity, and the profound resonance of events that cannot be fully understood, yet continue to captivate the imagination. The elevator footage, brief but mesmerizing, remained a cultural touchstone, a visual representation of disorientation, anxiety, and human fragility interacting with environmental circumstance, each frame scrutinized endlessly, every gesture interpreted, the video a haunting artifact capturing a final, tragic, and utterly real sequence of events, a reminder that ordinary spaces can intersect with vulnerability in ways that produce outcomes that are both eerie and indisputably true, a sequence replayed worldwide, leaving a lasting impression of both horror and fascination. Psychologists emphasized the subtle interplay of environment and mental state, how stairwells, elevators, and rooftop spaces can interact with anxiety, disorientation, and vulnerability to produce behaviors that are internally coherent yet externally inexplicable, a chilling lesson in the unpredictability of human behavior under pressure, a narrative illustrating how fragile minds interact with ordinary structures in extraordinary ways, producing events that are simultaneously tragic, surreal, and undeniable, a story that remains haunting and instructive for investigators, observers, and audiences alike. The narrative's complexity ensured its endurance, blending psychological insight, architectural observation, historical context, and human vulnerability into a story that is simultaneously real and surreal, a tragedy whose eerie qualities arise from circumstance, environment, and mind interacting in ways that defy conventional understanding, leaving the audience unsettled, intrigued, and profoundly affected, a story whose resonance is amplified by its authenticity, its inexplicability, and the haunting visual artifact of a young woman navigating her final, tragic moments. Her family's grief, compounded by global attention, highlighted the human cost behind the fascination, the relentless replay of events, speculation, and discussion, a constant reminder of loss, a haunting intersection of private sorrow and public obsession, illustrating how tragedy, once shared, becomes larger than the individual, embedded in cultural consciousness, and transformed into a narrative that is simultaneously instructive, terrifying, and deeply affecting, a story whose impact endures. Because it is real, yet eerily surreal in its circumstances. Investigators, journalists, and the public alike acknowledged the enduring mystery, the combination of mental fragility, environmental influence, and logistical improbability producing a narrative that resisted full reconstruction, a story where reality itself created eeriness, suspense, and fascination, a tragic sequence of events that remains iconic because of its combination of the mundane and the impossible, the ordinary and the surreal, human vulnerability and environmental circumstance, converging to leave a haunting mark on history, culture, and imagination. Years later, the story of Elisa Lam continues to resonate, a haunting testament to the fragility of life, the unpredictability of circumstance, and the eerie intersections of mind, environment, and reality, a narrative that transforms ordinary architecture into stages of suspense, ordinary moments into enduring mystery, and private tragedy into global fascination, a story that captivates, disturbs, and educates, leaving a chilling legacy that reminds the world that reality itself can produce horror more profound, more unsettling, and more haunting than fiction, a true story that remains unforgettable.